If an ingredient truly works, why does the beauty industry keep chasing the next miracle?
It's been relevant. It's been relevant for decades, but once in a while you'll hear a brand repackage it as the new frontier, which is kind of humorous.
You know, the market exploded long before there was clinical data on topical use, right?
It's a balance of expectations versus your reason to believe.
Do you think that peptides similarly are kind of encroaching on this space where it's like we had
really cute product packaging. It's only $20. So you're like, oh, what the heck? I'll buy, right?
Welcome back to another episode of Demystifying Cosmetics. If an ingredient truly works, why does the beauty industry keep chasing the next miracle? Are ingredient trends driven more by science or storytelling, or has the cycle accelerated with TikTok and ingredient-led marketing? To help navigate this conversation, I'm joined by Gloria Lu, co-founder of Chemist Confessions, a cosmetic chemist herself, and one of the most thoughtful voices unpacking skincare science on the internet today. Welcome, Gloria.
Hi, thanks for having me. Super excited. It's such a good topic. So thanks for thinking of me again.
Yeah, for sure. And you did come immediately to mind because I know I've watched so many videos where you guys break down ingredients that are, you know, the niacinamide, the vitamin C's that have been the powerhouses. And I think in conversations that I've had recently, there's a lot of focus on biotech and the emerging, you know, sodium DNA or PDRN and a lot of these materials that when you start asking the questions of how do they compare to, you know, the closest proxy that's commercialized, the performance maybe doesn't seem as compelling.
100%. I mean, sometimes I feel like the hype is a good starting point. It's the hype. With the hype comes interest, comes more studies, but that usually doesn't really match up with the marketing trajectory, to your point.
Yeah. And I'm curious from your perspective, what you've seen in terms of how ingredient trends actually move through the industry today.
I think there's a couple different scenarios. I want to say in recent years, I feel like in topical skincare, it always comes from a slightly adjacent field. So to your point, the sodium DNAs, the PDRNs and whatnot, they're all therapeutics I might have started in strictly therapeutic field in medicine or even in office aesthetics, and then it moves on into topicals. Then you have things like CBD that is just trendy because it's trending in general as a category in other uses, from food supplements to other forms of therapeutics, and makes its way into skincare. So I feel like that's how it's been. I don't think we've had Victoria and I sometimes joke that cosmetics, topicals specifically, seems to be a dumping ground of other fields. And it's true. There's not as many ingredients designed to be topical, and the trend started, strictly speaking, from topicals.
Yeah. And CBD is a good one. That actually is an example that I have in terms of, you know, the market exploded long before there was clinical data on topical use, right? I think there was this one study in 2014 that emerged where it was shown that a certain cannabidiol, I guess they're considered, could regulate lipid production and inflammation in sebacites, but that was in a cell culture, right? And then people took that information that occurred in and was like, great. So that I think is a great example of where, you know, the consumer enthusiasm accelerated much faster than the research cycle. And, you know, I think we've done a lot better for CBD and a lot of the derivatives now in terms of like how they might interplay, but that is definitely a great example. So another one that, you know, almost we talk about ingredients and the emergence and then those that maybe persist, that are almost immune to the hype cycle. And I feel like niacinamide is a great example, right? It's been used in dermatology for decades, and yet every so often you keep seeing this reappearance and people talking about it like we've never heard of it before.
Yes. I think I've now been in this industry long enough to see a few of these trend cycles come and go. And another one is hyaluronic acid. It feels like if you've been in the industry, it's relevant. It's been relevant. It's been relevant for decades. But once in a while, you'll hear a brand repackage it as the new frontier, which is kind of humorous.
Do you think, and also because of that kind of the hype cycle that they continue to exist in, do you think it's because mechanistically they have multiple approaches, right? So niacinamide can be affects barrier lipids, inflammation, pigmentation, sebum regulation, right? Same with hyaluronic acid. It can act as a humectant at certain molecular weights, can penetrate and we believe have some impact to collagen, elastin production. So do you think that because they have broader application that maybe they're more resilient?
Yeah, I think that definitely helps a lot. I think the depth of the story, to your point, is definitely very helpful because niacinamide is such a jack of all trades that it can attach itself to whatever might be trending, right? If it's the season for hyperpigmentation, it's a shoo-in. If you're talking about pairing it with aggressive actives like retinoid, if retinoids are trending, it can attach itself to that. So I think in the case of niacinamide very specifically, that's definitely helpful. With niacinamide, it's also worth noting that from a chemist angle, it's easy to work with. So it's also easy to have it in a wide range of applications and formula types. So that all lends to its longevity. From a marketing angle, besides from like the different angles you can tell the story, I think it's also helpful that niacinamide is I hate to say it like this from as a chemist, but it's relatively easy to pronounce. It has a relatively short chemical name without getting too foo-foo. I think there's a degree of science that becomes almost sci-fi sounding. It's hard for people to attach to the story. So niacinamide really is that perfect storm of it works, it's got different angles, and it's a easier concept for people to talk about.
Yeah, and niacinamide is also one of those that doesn't come with those quirky trade names, right? It's always just niacinamide.
yeah. It doesn't get too hokey beyond just niacinamide.
Yeah, right. So another area that we've been seeing a lot of, proliferation in is peptides, right?
Yes.
And there's and there's been decades of research, right? So the signal peptide matrixyl dates back to 2005 in the International Journal of Cosmetic Science, where it showed improvements for photoaged skin. And then you have the development of like copper peptides, right? Where Larry Pickard has studied extensively for wound healing and tissue repair. So there's clearly real science for some peptides, but at the same time, the category has become so heavily commercialized.
Yes.
So do you think that, there is also perhaps peptides suffer from being scientifically legitimate category that's also extremely easy to market?
I think it's almost a good foil to niacinamide because it is niacinamide is one singular molecule that's been talked about in slice and dice in almost every single angle. Whereas peptides, you can slice and dice at every single angle because there is a gazillion of them out there. And that as a concept is really hard to communicate for consumers. You can have your oligopeptide 3 SH86 hexapeptide. These things kind of get lost. And the reality is with the naming scheme in INCI, the same INCI may not even refer to the exact same peptide. So then you get into to your point, the trade name peptides like matrixyl that's been studied for decades. I think it's now this category of opportunity where there's room to play, right? The word peptide, because it can mean a broad range of things, but it's associated with high levels of efficacy that from a marketing perspective, it is a treasure trove. You can put peptides and associate it with a lot of things, but on the consumer end, it's definitely a cause for confusion and just this discomfort of not knowing if what you're getting is really worth your money. I have mixed feelings about this. I think obviously matrixyl being a trademark that's really successful in both, on the industry side, as chemists all know about matrixyl. And it's also very well recognized on the consumer end. Yeah. So that one's like a no-brainer. But a lot of the newer age ones, it's harder for consumers to decipher. And honestly, even from a chemist perspective, you have to look at it from, the sourcing, the trade names, and the studies. So it's a murky category, but I will say, I think in terms of what it can do, the range is just really wide. It goes from, it can be that really awesome missing link your routine to, well, I am pretty sure that doesn't do anything. So.
Yeah. So let's say, you touched upon it a little bit in terms of like, what you look for when you're formulating. When you are, looking at if a customer or you're interested in putting in a quote unquote peptide, what is some of the data that you would want to see in order for you to kind of establish that credibility?
I think you alluded to it already previously is in vitro or cell culture testing is super popular in this industry in the sense that people see it and they throw some jazz hands and they run with it. So for me, a category like peptides is we're definitely looking for some level of in vivo testing. And in this industry, sometimes in vivo testing can be very basic and almost minimalistic. Even an N equals 10 topical in vivo testing to us is a good indication. A lot of peptides. So
like directionality, right?
Exactly. A lot of peptides still live in that in vitro stage. And that's when we, on the industry side, it's not kosher on the consumer side, but we will see claims like it definitely boosts collagen production and it protects your DNA, all sorts of wild things that we shouldn't legally say to consumers. But then you look at the data, you dig into it, and the way it's validated is very early stage, very premature. And a lot of times, in vitro testing could translate to topical efficacy for sure, but that route is a little circuitous. And without that next step in validating it topically, we just don't feel good about it.
Yeah. And I think from a, consumer standpoint, I'm starting to see more brands on their websites actually cite the group they've been working with in terms of like, we did a consumer perception study supported by the benchmarking company. But also I find when they actually publish significant amounts of data, so transparency, but also the images, unadulterated images of that were used for the study, that those can sometimes be that like distinguishing, not necessarily for a consumer for which peptide to look for, but what finished product to maybe look for.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that is also a whole, it gives you a more, I think when we do our podcast on the content side, of course, we try to look at those really zoomed in studies where it's like 1-star ingredient versus a placebo. Then we can differentiate, figure out what it does at that concentration level. But on the consumer end, we do always say like brands that do, because very few brands market just 1-star ingredient. So if they have their own concoction, it could be synergistically bringing those benefits. It could just be one ingredient may be there for marketing reasons, but 3 other ones are doing the heavy lifting. You don't really know, but if you have that level of clinical testing, then that is the piece of the puzzle that can help a consumer make a decision.
Yeah. And I do want to revisit the CBD example because what's interesting about CBD was, right, that the early work was very mechanistic or small scale studies and cell cultures. But basically the popular, because it became so massive, it was almost like it was a large uncontrolled market experiment, right? So it was like, we're not quite sure what it does, but then you had all these people using it. And that's when like research, started to catch up. Do you think that peptides similarly are kind of encroaching on this space where it's like we had mechanistic or small scale studies for a peptide that existed forever. And now we're like, well, they're safe and we'll spin out a whole bunch and we'll have people use them. And then maybe in 5 years, we'll understand why they worked.
Ooh, CBD is a great example of that, 100%. And it's by the time we saw kind of interesting topical data come out, that the marketing choo-choo train is like off the rails.
I know, yeah. Like it was almost like, oh no, that's so last summer, right? Like,
yeah, 100%. I think peptides are here to stay, mostly because the more exploratory ones. So the way peptides are sliced and diced can come and go like CBD, right? I think right now you have angles like it's a senescent peptide, or it is a biomimetic peptide. It is a signaling peptide. These specific communications and categorize the way you categorize peptides, I think those can trend in and out like a CBD. But because you have old timers like matrixyl or gerling, where it's very much more established, you have that fallback baseline level where the communication can match out with performance better. So I think there's always going to be a consumer interest at the base level, like, hey, this is matrixyl works, therefore peptides as a category, there must be something to it. So I think the market will always be more primed for a new way to slice and dice it. So peptides, I don't think will go away. Just there might be unfortunate sacrifices along the way.
Real quick, raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor, or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. You know, things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucaps line by going to tagra.com/cellucaps. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
Way that become a CBD, but peptides as a category will stay.
Yeah. So another interesting area to touch upon is on ceramides. Ceramides, the science behind ceramides has been around for decades, right? What they do to the stratum corneum, the barrier function was discovered as early as 1990s to the early aughts. Early aughts is like my favorite thing to say now, 2000s. But they really didn't become mainstream until later. And now even I've minimally used them because of the cost actually associated with a lot of them. But why do you think, in that case, it took some 30 odd years for this trend to really explode?
Ooh, that is a good one. Now it's in everything, right? And to your point, traditionally, ceramides has such a cost barrier to more mass market brands. Ceramides to me is very much a industry side push for it to explode. It's expensive. It's hard to work with. It's got a lot of great stories, but just on the formulating end, it's very difficult. And I think there was a big push on the supplier side to create different concoctions of it, to create different blends of it, to help it go into formula for you to tell that story. I think that's helped a lot with its explosion. And I think, what's a good way to phrase it? I'm trying to be very PC about it. I think with these newer ways of these different sourcing of ceramide, different ways suppliers are slicing and dicing, and there is another level of chemists needed vetting around it because there's always the classic blends like SK Influx that Evonik's tested topically in different clinicals, on and off again in several different ways, so that we understand a lot better versus pure ceramides. And even pure ceramides with the same inky names can have different structured differences. And those are not things that's easily communicated to the consumer. And it's basically all on the brand and on the chemist to do their due diligence. And I think with these newer ingredients, there's a convenience factor, even ones that you can market to have ceramides, but really it's a very low level and or a not validated form of it that to me has actually unironically helped with its popularity because now it's easier to incorporate. Now you can put it in a wider range of things. But I think it's really I hope it stays. I do like ceramides. We use it extensively in our own product line, but I think it's almost diluted the value of ceramide a little bit. All of us who's been in the industry for quite some time, you've seen those really good ingredients that is a pain to work with, to now these newer age plant derived, this and that, fancy ceramides that will go into water, but does it actually deliver the benefits that you associate with ceramides is a question mark. So anyway, I have complex feelings about that one, but I do suspect it's because a lot of barriers to formulation has been significantly lowered.
Yeah. So it seems almost like, I think I've been in this category before, specifically in biotech, where, you find this great molecule and you want people to adopt it, but in order to adopt it, you need to change a lot of your cost structure, how you're going to incorporate it, how you're going to handle it. We don't even know for sure how we'll mass produce it, right? That there was like this disconnect that existed despite, having some really good data. I think another fun category to go into is botanicals, but not, broadly botanicals, but specifically Bakuchiol, right? So, it's a botanical ingredient that's been marketed as a retinol alternative over the years. But, I kind of saw the rise in 2019, I think, because there were some published clinical studies in the British Journal of Dermatology. But that one seems to actually have cycled through that hype cycle very quickly.
I think I think that one, or at least I feel like Bakuchiol didn't die completely. I don't think it's like some of the trends are like dead and buried to the point where you can barely find products with it anymore. But to your point, I think there's a couple things at play with that one. We do tout Bakuchiol because of all the plant alternatives to retinoids or retinol specifically, it's one of the only ones that's been tested in any level to the same like degree as a retinol and being benched against other well-known actives. So that to me is like, that gets a huge pass for us because Lord knows there's a lot more plant stuff that gets touted for why? No idea. So, but I think ultimately that trend didn't last because at the end of the day, people have a lot more know-how now in terms of navigating established ingredients like retinol. So they realized that, there is a way for me to manage my skin, manage retinization with actual retinol or other retinoids. I think Bakuchiol kind of fell off the wayside, partially because Retinol has become really popular. Then people feel like, this is the real stuff. This is an actual retinoid, but it still doesn't irritate as much as maybe tretinoin or retinol. So why would I use a plant version of not really retinoid kind of thing? So I think that didn't help.
And I feel like too, using your example of the retinol, right? That was previously a prescription only product, right? And then it kind of moved to, and so I'm curious if your thoughts on, competing with, and I don't know if I have a good example of any others that have, gone from being a prescription only based to now over the counter, but I could see, competing against that being very difficult. Right. Because anything that is prescription only or prescribed to you from a dermatologist has kind of, probably assume to the consumer high degree of credibility.
100%. And I think that's why to date, a lot of people, introduction to retinoids is still prescribed tretinoin. And, there's nothing wrong with it. And I think there's definitely a skin concern where you can benefit from having a derm walk you through that, process. And now with like telederms being super popular, it's the barrier to getting that is super low. I think having that as an introduction is definitely not a bad thing, but as someone who's on and off tested these prescribed products, I think there's definitely still a place and an art to formulating the cosmetics version of it. A lot of the very industrial tretinoin creams that you will get in prescription are very industrial. A lot of them don't necessarily layer super well. They don't take into account of a lot of other desires your skin might have. And it's just a hodgepodge of formula that you get that's it's stable and delivers the prescribed molecules intended, but not a lot of frills with that. So I think there's still a well done cosmetic grade level of a retinol cream. There's still a place for that 100%. And the good thing about this field is I think there's people, as they get more comfortable with their skincare, they get more in tune with what they need. They feel more confident in terms of, okay, a derm's helped my hand through the prescription tread process. My skin is now at this level. I don't need a kind of crappy cream that's going to do this for me. But what I can do is I can vet out a really well done cosmetic version that will help me maintain this level of efficacy without that, but it still layers well. It plays well with my other products, and I don't have the pain of using this product. I think there's just a lot of nuance to someone's skincare routine for a range of products. And I think, I don't think having a prescription first actually hurts the category. If anything else, I think it lends the credibility of the rest of the molecules. Another example might be pigmentation, but that's a can of worms where I think, hydroquinones, it's all unique case and you can't use it forever. Unsupervised, much less. So that is a different kind of conversation. But I think retinoids actually help that it came from the prescription world.
Yeah. And now talking about ingredients that refuse to die, growth factors. So, right, they existed in skincare for decades despite skepticism. And so, I'm curious to get your thoughts on why, they've remained commercially viable despite, I would say, regulatory gray area.
I think regulatory gray area is actually putting it very polite.
Exactly. Yes. I think it encompasses what the actual scenario is very well. But there's also like this biological plausibility, right? That is like, is it, is the science there? And there's consumer fascination with kind of this regenerative medicine. Do you think this like growth factors is just this, constant pressure and belief that we just won't age?
Ooh, that is a loaded question. I think that's absolutely part of it, right? I think there is that, I don't think wishful thinking is the right way because there is a lot of people working on the state of the art of this field. I just think that there is always a market for I don't want to say never aging, but deep down inside, you're like, hey man, if I never age, that would be awesome. So I am this willingness to believe in the science. And I think by nature, growth factors or anything that comes from the in-office world, like exosomes or PDRN, they all have the same story of it's high science, but also mysterious. It's a lot of very sciencey talk and a lot of really not FTC kosher commercial lingo, but also there's that appeal there for sure of like, oh, is this really, it sounds like a very plausible way of giving me that fountain of youth. So there's that like willingness to believe from consumers that I don't think it'll ever die. Again, I think it might be sliced and diced a little differently. It might be packaged with other stories like, again, exosomes, PDRN, whatever. But it honestly all come from the same baseline, the same story background. And I don't think it will go away because honestly, with the in-office stuff, it will just keep lending it to more spotlight where people will make that association topically, even though what you're using office and what you're pairing it with in office is not the same thing as topicals. But that fascination will always be there. The market interest will always be there, which means there'll always be someone making a new version of it.
Yeah. Honestly, the idea of, anything that's called a growth factor kind of scares me, right? Because it's meant for differentiation of cells, proliferation of cells. And a lot of times I just think of that one episode of SpongeBob when Squidward eats too many Krabby Patties and it's just like this big like lump of fat. I feel as if, you get some of these products and it's like, is it going to, cause, and obviously we haven't seen those cases and this is me fear mongering. But the lack of credibility, I think, in terms of clinical studies that have been done is really fascinating to then see that that hasn't discouraged customers from associating growth factors with with skin health.
You know, it's so funny you use that example. I feel like people are both really concerned with topical safety, but also really brave when it comes to the neuroscience of it.
Oh, totally.
But then there's also an underlying feeling of like, this totally works, but it's not going to be harmful because topicals don't really work that well. You know, there's like a lot of polarizing viewpoints all baked into the same products. I think is it's kind of funny. And I do hope that at least with the vested interest in these categories, again, hopefully that prompts more studies and we have at least vested interest in longer term understanding of these ingredients.
Yeah. And, when you say that, and I'm so guilty, right? The duality of what I do is scrutinize ingredients. And then I'm currently using this cream called Adipo, which is supposed to promote the adipose fat cells, right? Equal parts like, oh, I'm skeptical, but I'm going to use it because I have hope. So
because why why not?
I saw the before and after pictures. I'm going to have hope. But yeah, that weird duality of like existing in this kind of contradictory space. So I'm guilty. I'm guilty of that. And you mentioned it, but the kind of last one that I want to focus on is exosomes, because that's like the next ingredient, right? That there's a growing interest in that intersection of regenerative medicine with now extracellular vesicles. And there is some, emerging dermatology literature as early as 2021 discussing exosomes and skin biology, but not sure if we're at the stage of translational pathway from regenerative medicine. But do you think exosomes are an example of an ingredient that might be entering the very early stage of the hype cycle?
I think it's already midpoint is maybe 30% through the cycle is where I think it's at. Mostly because any ingredient supplier trade show that you go to now, everyone under the sun has an exosome. So we are currently in the cycle of, I don't want to use the word remarketing, but certain things are getting marketed as exosome when it's not. Certain things are, and everything is now an exosome. It's like when everything was a stem cell. So we are at that phase, and it's going to flood the market. I'm sure every brand is exploring their version of exosome, whether it's from rose or cabbage, and they are going to put their spin out there. And then we're going to see a bunch of new launches this year and the next. And whether or not that leads to consumer fatigue and therefore ultimately the death of the cycle, or it's a duking it out and then there's a couple that emerges as the champion of topical exosomes, I'm not sure. I haven't seen enough topical data to feel confident that it is here to stay for good. But I will say what I'm interested in seeing play out is this is a category where I believe there is more activity on the patent side. So on the legal, trademark, proprietary kind of exclusivity kind of elbowing coming in. And usually when a category falls into that level of warfare, you could get something pretty interesting on the other end.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of these trends, whether it's like the PDRN or the exosomes, it's really just all like spent media, right? They're like ingredients that are things that like were not either intentioned or are, byproducts that are not sexy, but they're like, they have some fun stuff in them.
Yeah. Again, we are a bit of a dumping ground of technologies from elsewhere. So
yeah, for sure. So to wrap up this episode, I'd love to talk about building like a simple framework. So if someone sees a new trending ingredient online, what questions should they ask before deciding whether it's truly innovative or just part of the next hype cycle?
Yeah, I think our gold standard is we do always see if there is actual topical in vivo data. And to that end, there's also different levels of these type of testing. Is it just a consumer perception study? Which I will say I think at the beginning of my career, I am almost a little bit vaguely dismissive of those studies because it feels like you can structure a survey and pick and choose some of the responses to get those like 90% agree kind of stat lines. But I will say, even if it's just a consumer perception, I think it's better than not having any in vivo. Clinical testings with measurements or expert grading is wonderful. And then the gold standard on top of that is if it's benched against either a placebo or something more established on the market. You will rarely, if never, really see that in commercialized products. But if you do, those are all like super duper positive signs. Like those reason to believe. The second thing to pay attention to is, let's say you have seen a clinical and you think it's worthy of your investment. Read the fine print a little bit if you can find it in terms of use level and frequency of use. Because sometimes that is, we see that in, this is a size subject, but we see that in nutraceuticals a lot where, you know, like say liquid collagen is really popular. And that's another one that comes in and out of trend all the time. But if you look at the clinicals that's done, people are guzzling that thing in clinicals. So anyway, I think that we sometimes see that in topicals as well, where in the clinical testing, they are using it at least twice a day, or if not, 3 times a day, or some sort of protocol that isn't really realistic or really not how it's marketed as. So that's something to pay attention to. And the last thing is, this is a side comment, is I think there is a place for feel-good products and workhorse products, right? I think if you see a science that you're like, you know what, I don't know if the evidence is all there, but I really like the story. I really like the brand. Whatever your reason to believe is, I think it's fine. I think it's just it's a balance of expectations versus your reason to believe. Because ultimately, I think us who've been in the industry for some time, sometimes the joy of just using skincare for the experience is a little robbed. You know, you get too critical of the data. So I think if you see a reason to believe and you want to stick to it, and no harm, no foul, I think that's fine as well. Just know what you are getting. You know, I think time and time again, you see K-Beauty come out with some really, really awesome story with a really cute product packaging. It's only $20. So you're like, oh, what the heck? I'll buy, right? If you're holding them to high science standards, maybe you're just going to be disappointed.
And I think equally going back to that, also, you know, if you are using a product that you don't like that has a lot of clinical evidence, also don't be afraid to stop using it, right?
Exactly.
And it's definitely I think it's, you know, ingredient hype cycles are interesting, but the reality is, going back to, you know, consumers, everyone has a different reason to believe, and everyone's routine is very unique. And so I think it is really difficult to kind of navigate as a consumer, understanding whether or not these ingredients are valid or not. But hopefully the industry as a whole, overarching, is just saying they're safe, right? That's our role.
Yes, exactly.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for joining today. I enjoyed getting your perspective on kind of some of these ingredient hype cycle maps. So
thanks so much for having me again.
Yeah. All right.